Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the history of anti-Zionist Jewish activism. It's a history that's rooted in the first half of the 20th century, a history of the American left and even the American Communist Party. My guest for this is Benjamin Balthaser. Benjamin Balthaser is Associate Professor of Multi-Ethnic U.S. Literature at Indiana University, South Bend. He's the author of several books, including Anti-Imperialism Modernism, Race and Transnational Radical Culture from the Great Depression to the Cold War, and Dedication, which is a personal history of growing up in a Jewish red diaper family. His forthcoming book from Verso, out this fall, is called Citizens of the Whole World, the American Jewish Left and Cultures of Anti-Zionism. Benjamin Balthaser, it's my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you, Mitch. It's lovely to be here. So,
I have heard, especially in recent months, a number of, and we've spoke to many anti-Zionist Jewish activists in the past few months alone, and I continually hear this saying that their anti-Zionism is a part of their Jewishness. What does that mean?
Well, that's a great question. And yeah, there's an accusation out there, particularly among Jewish Zionists, that anti-Zionist Jews either are somehow fake Jews or are sort of cynically mobilizing their Jewish identity to make a claim against Israel or a claim against Zionism. And I'd actually flip it around. I would suggest that the sort of consensus about Zionism in the Jewish community is actually the aberration. So the consensus about Zionism emerges really in the early 1970s, and already by the 90s, if not the 2000s, this consensus is clearly fraying, right? So I mean, on the one hand, obviously, you see large Jewish institutions such as the ADL and the Jewish Federation firmly back Zionism, Hillel on campuses. But we also see, Jewish
Did they always back Zionism? Did the ADL always back Zionism?
No. And this is actually the interesting thing. So my project is really about the left, and the ADL has never really been a left-wing organization. At best, kind of, milquetoast liberal in the 50s and 60s. But no, I mean, the Zionist consensus really doesn't emerge until really after the Six-Day War, there's actually a really great dissertation by.
And that's 1967.
Yeah, 1967. Yeah, and then actually it really takes a while before Jewish institutions really kind of get on board with this idea that being a Zionist is the same thing as being Jewish. And so there's an enormous amount of research that's been done. There's a book by Jeffrey Levin that came out this past year. Again, there's this really great dissertation, which I think will become a book soon by Berkman, which really sort of talks about the slow process by which, particularly after 1967, you start seeing Zionism actually replace a number of other concerns by even sort of mainstream liberal Jewish institutions like the ADL or the American Jewish Committee. And so, what was the American Jewish Committee working on before 1967? It's like, well, they're working on Holocaust refugees, administering to the poor, trying to fund religious services, temples, publish Jewish intellectuals, a range of concerns. And this gets
race
narrowed.
Relations too, right?
Yeah, race relations. Yeah, of course, a lot of these groups were, again, they were not radical, right? So the AJC and ADL were not radical, but took a kind of liberal position on civil rights, right? And so we're backing the NAACP, and there's a long kind of history of the AJC, American Jewish Committee, which is the committee that represents Reform Jews, or the organization that represents Reform Jews, and liberal African-American organizations like the NAACP. And so basically the AJC and the ADL were, you could say, the kind of Jewish counterparts to groups like the NAACP, sort of normatively liberal, generally in favor of civil rights, concerned with mostly domestic issues. And then again, after the Six-Day War and the 1970s, there emerges this consensus among the Jewish elite that Zionism is really the main focus of their organizations. And this is really complicated. I think there's not a single answer about why this happens. And I want to get back to your other question about the Jewish left and how anti-Zionism really informs Jewishness. But I think it's important first to sort of say, how did Zionism become this thing that define Jewishness right now. And a couple of historians, Amy Kaplan is one of them, have pointed out that really actually it was the United States' embrace of Israel after 1967 that actually happened before, on some level, the kind of mass Jewish consensus in the United States around Israel. So the United States was somewhat ambivalent about Israel. They supported Israel when it was founded, but of course there's the famous 1956 Suez Affair in which Eisenhower basically told Israel to stand down and refused to support Israel as an invasion of Sinai. And it was in 1967 when Israel basically single-handedly defeated the Soviet-backed armies of Arab nationalists in Syria and Egypt and Jordan, that the United States, and really it wasn't just the United States Pentagon, it was like the entire media, sort of went nuts because this is the moment in which the United States was, famously in a so-called quagmire in Vietnam, was losing to the Vietnamese revolutionaries. And here was this small country that in 6 days defeats all of the United States enemies, right, and defeats them soundly, right? And at the same time, of course, also too, there was a famous movie by starring Paul Newman, Exodus, which told the story, which not only was pro-Israel, and so tells this heroic story of scrappy Jewish Zionists defeating Arab armies, tells the story essentially as a U.S. Western, right? And so basically makes Israel into, essentially a Gary Cooper film, right? Where they're, basically, out in the desert, taking on the indigenous people heroically. And so, of course, you can see through this narrative now and say this is quite racist. But at the time, I think what had happened, and again, a lot of historians have sort of pointed out this kind of love affair with Israel in the mainstream media, is that Israel became like America, as one historian put it, like America, but better, right? And as actually one person put it, there are no homeless people in Israel, there are no anti-Vietnam protests in Israel, there are no hippies in Israel. Of course, there are hippies in Israel, but anyways, there are no hippies in Israel. There's no pot smoking in Israel, and this little scrappy country defeated militarily, the combined armies of the Soviet-backed Arab nationalist states. And so this sort of began the kind of U.S. kind of mainstream military and cultural love affair with Israel. And Jews, American Jews, particularly American Jewish liberals, followed suit. And the thesis on some level by historians like Dov Waxman is that most American Jews essentially want to marry their Jewish liberalism with their idea of what it means to be a good American, right? And to be a good American is to be liberal, to back civil rights, to vote Democrat, et cetera, be civically patriotic. And so when Israel became essentially a country that the US supported, then it suddenly became kosher to be Zionist, right? And to be Zionist meant to be a good American, right? And you can see, of course, this falling apart now. This consensus is falling apart now. It's falling apart very much out in the open. But it's also falling apart along lines that are very distinctly American, right? So yeah, so some of the debate, of course, is about Israel and Palestine, and a lot of it, of course, is about Israel and Palestine. But a lot of it is really about American domestic politics. What do we think about student protesters? What do we think about the far left? What do we think about? And it maps onto lines, that are similar to some, for instance, public opinion about the George Floyd protests or Black Lives Matter, and that in some ways, what I think is being debated about Israel, and this has always been true about the Jewish left, is sort of what does it mean really to be an American, right? What does it mean to be a leftist and an American, or a liberal and an American? What does it mean to be a minority group and an American? And I think the Zionist consensus emerged at this moment when being a Zionist meant being a good American. And it also came in a moment when I would argue that Jews were sort of being incorporated into kind of mainstream whiteness, really for the first time, going to good universities, moving out to the suburbs. And so there's this kind of collapsing of, being a good Jew, good American Jew means, supporting Zionism, but also identifying with a certain kind of, you could say, suburban whiteness. And I think, again, this is sort of what is erupting right now on American campuses, right? And the debate that's happening really inside the Jewish world, right? And I don't know that everyone can sort of kind of see the sort of internal Jewish debate about this, But inside the Jewish world, kind of to go back to your original question, is what does it mean to be a good Jewish person, right, in America at this moment? And for some people, that is to align with the state of Israel and to align essentially with the Pentagon, American foreign policy. But for, I think, a much larger, particularly swath of Jews, really younger Jews, they go back to a much older history in which being a good Jewish American basically is to align, as you alluded to earlier, with civil rights struggles, with the struggles of other quote unquote minority groups in America, and to see being Jewish as being basically, part of the kind of fabric of hopefully a pluralistic, more democratic American society. And they see something, not only the state of Israel, but of course, this militaristic support for the state of Israel as really being anathema, not only to, sort of general values of human rights, but this kind of longer history of, I would say, a kind of left Jewish support for democracy, for civil rights, for the rights of disenfranchised people, of which Jews, for a large part of our history in the U.S. Was us. So.
Yeah, I get the sense when I hear that being anti-Zionist is a part of my being Jewish. Mm-hmm. I get the sense that's also referring to, and maybe this is our segue into the 1930s, that is a sense of, as being a Jew, I'm anti-fascist. Mm-hmm. And there is this similarity between Zionism and fascism that was recognized.
Yes.
Back in the 1930s. And of course, we're talking 1930s. This is sort of the rise. This is when fascism comes to power.
Yeah, that's the other thing I think that's sort of a contemporary aberration of really the 1960s, 1950s and 1960s. This association of Zionism with liberalism and the democracy in the Middle East. For many Jews in the 1930s, as you mentioned, and of course, the 1930s was really kind of the heyday of the Jewish left in America. This is the heyday of the Communist Party. This is the heyday of the labor movement, kind of the nascent beginnings of the civil rights movement with the Scottsboro trial, kind of when the first things we would recognize kind of as early sit-ins. The first desegregation orders happened in the 1940s. And so the 1930s is really kind of the heyday of the Jewish left. And the Communist Party is it's not anti-Semitic to say the Communist Party in the United States was very hugely Jewish. So by some estimates,
it was hugely Jewish.
It was hugely Jewish. Yes, by some estimates, it was half Jewish. And if you want to think about that, the Communist Party averaged about 100,000 members from the mid-30s up until the Red Scare. And if half of them are Jewish, then it becomes one of the largest Jewish organizations in the United States, much larger than the ADL or the AJC, et cetera, particularly also because the Communist Party had a huge turnover, as many activist groups do. And so, yeah, they saw Zionism in the 1930s and 1940s really as a form of ethno-nationalism, right? And so nationalism in the 1930s, that meant fascism, right? And if you were called a nationalist, that was basically synonymous with being called a fascist. In fact, actually, there was a huge debate in the Communist Party in the 1930s because some communists wanted to say, actually, we're good Americans and good American patriots. And someone, the pushback was always to call yourself an American patriot, it's to call yourself a nationalist, and nationalism is synonymous with fascism. And their critique of nationalism went in two ways. So in the one sense, they saw nationalism as aligned with fascist states like, Mussolini's Italy, Franco's Spain, Peronism in Argentina, of course, Nazism. But they also saw fascism as an alignment of the working class with the bourgeoisie, right? That is, the problem with fascism is not only that it is racist and anti-democratic, but that it conscripts working class people into the project through a mass movement into the project of the bourgeoisie. And this was their analysis of Zionism in the 1930s, is that it aligns the interests of working class Jews with the Jewish bourgeoisie, Jewish bankers, Jewish nationalists, et cetera. And of course, they looked at the deal between Balfour and the early Zionists. They said, Balfour is a British aristocrat and an imperialist. Why would we want to align with this person, right? And so by aligning with British imperialism, you're sort of giving up the game, right? You're admitting essentially that Zionism is this right-wing nationalist project.
So it was seen
Um,
as imperialist
oh yes,
Zionism.
absolutely. No, and this was also very clear. This notion that no one thought of Zionism as being imperialism, until I don't know, the Columbia sit-in, 3 weeks ago, or the rise of SJP. People thought of it as an imperialism even before the state of Israel was formally established. In fact, that was one of the largest critiques of Israel, is that it was, again, it kind of aligned with British imperialism. And, there were some Jewish Zionists before the foundation. Zionists will often state that, oh, well, what about, Hashomer Hatzer and these sort of left-wing Zionist groups? There were some left-wing Zionist groups who did not imagine founding a Jewish-only state, but they were always in the minority. And this is one of the points that Jewish writers in the 1930s like to make. This is actually the point that Hannah Arendt sort of famously makes in her essay in 1947, Zionism Reconsidered, that Zionists may have a kind of rhetoric of the left, the kibbutzim, again, sort of the left Zionist movement, that it's a national liberation struggle. But, Arendt's argument, but also arguments of sort of well-known Jewish socialists in the 1930s and 40s, such as Mike Gold, Robert Gessner, Alexander Bittelman, although Bittelman later becomes a Zionist himself, was that the actual project of having to clear land, expel the native population, essentially build a state, have a militia, the Palmach. It basically means that no matter what your rhetoric is, you're going to be aligned with the revisionists, the far right, the Jabotinskyites, right? Just through the very fact of the project that you've engaged in, right? That it materially is going to transform the project from whatever you think it is.
That even if you have Marxist ideas with the society you want to build, which correct me, I thought that that was an element within the Zionist movement, but that even if you do want to do and even do all of that, there's still this recognition though of the connection to British imperialism.
Yeah, and this again is where things get complicated. And this is also on some level ancient history. So, after the 1948 war, and particularly after the 1967 war, whatever remnants of the sort of Buber, Einstein, binational state, Hashomer Hatzer, binational state, socialist Zionists, that is over. Like I said, it was sort of decided literally on the battlefield and in the Nakba, the massacres and expulsions of almost 1 million Palestinians. But yeah, there were, like I said, really, up until the 1960s, there were some holdouts who tried to think of Zionism as a kind of potentially left-wing or still inherently left-wing socialist project of national liberation. And of course, there's a emotional truth to this. So, there are a lot of kind of minority nationalist movements in Europe and in the colonized world of oppressed peoples, and the nationalist movement of Jews to found some kind of autonomous space free of anti-Semitism is a very old idea in many ways, right? Zionism emerges in the late 19th century, but the notion of Jews wanting some kind of cultural or political autonomy in the face of European, and particularly European anti-Semitism goes back. And of course, there are other left-wing socialist Jewish nationalist movements, most famously the Bund, but of course there are also Soviet experiments in cultural autonomy for Jews in the Soviet Empire. But yeah, there's actually, going back to your question about socialist Zionism and nationalism, imperialism, there's actually, I did a number of interviews for this project, and one of the people that I interviewed was a former actual member of Hashomer Hatzer. It's a person who's actually you've had on your show, the scholar Joel Bennon. And he tells the story of actually being on a Hashomer Hatzer kibbutz in the 60s, early 60s, and he's imagining that he's going and, joining a socialist collective, right, to build a Jewish socialist country. And he first notices that people in the kibbutz are using this kind of racist language against the Palestinian population. I'm not going to repeat the words that he heard, but they're basically the Israeli equivalent of the N-word, right? And except for Palestinians. And he said, that made him incredibly uncomfortable. And very shortly after, and he's sort of processing hearing this kind of language on the kibbutz. Very shortly after, they're watching, of all things, Hair, translated in, dubbed into Hebrew on TV. And there's this scene in which people, tear up a flag in the film. And, he's clapping and laughing, and the Americans are laughing because they're all hippies. And none of the Israelis are laughing, right? And he's like, oh, these people are nationalists, right? And for them, burning a flag, particularly an American flag, is an abomination. He's like, oh, right, this is actually not socialism. This is nationalism with a kind of socialist flavor. And again, I don't think that some of the socialist Jewish Zionists were necessarily insincere. I think, again, it's in the very project of having to militarily build a state that basically means you're going to ally with force and violence, right? And I think this is the other part of Jewish critique of Zionism, is that there's a long history of kind of Jewish critiques of violence, and this is also, I think, the other part of the Jewish critique of nationalism, is that nation states, and Jews have been on the receiving end of violent nation states as people without, famously without a nation, for millennia. And so one of the sort of long-standing, even sort of pre-left Jewish critiques of nation states is that nation states are inherently violent. And the scholar Jonathan Boyarin, in his really wonderful book on sort of thinking about Jewish gender, talks about even medieval images of the wicked child in the Passover ceremony as one who is armed like a Roman, right? And this notion that somehow state power, imperial power, is somehow anathema to a vulnerable minority, a vulnerable diasporic minority, is a very long and old tradition. And I think, like I said, gets kind of picked up by the Jewish left and sort of translated, you could say, into sort of Marxist terminology. But it's a very old idea within Jewish culture. Obviously, it's not the only idea. There are the Maccabees and Jewish nationalists, etc. But this, like I said, when people are calling back to a Jewish tradition, they're calling back to a long left-wing tradition, but they're also, I think, calling back to a tradition that's even far older than that, of thinking about nonviolence, anti-violence, and the violent power of states as being something that's fundamentally dangerous for Jews and sort of un-Jewish.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Benjamin Balthaser, Associate Professor of Multi-Ethnic U.S. Literature at Indiana University, South Bend. His forthcoming book that will be out in the fall is called Whole World, The American Jewish Left and Cultures of Anti-Zionism. He has graciously agreed to talk to us before his book came out to talk about the history of Jewish anti-Zionist activism. You mentioned Mike Gold earlier. Who was Mike Gold? And we're still talking about the Communist Party in the 1930s here?
Yes. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up Mike Gold. He's one of my kind of favorite mid-century Jewish writers. So Mike Gold, he's probably most famous for two things. One is writing probably the best-selling Jewish novel, Jewish left-wing novel, at least, of the 1930s and 40s, called Jews Without Money, which was, on its publication in 1930, was an immediate hit. I mean, it was translated into dozens of languages, sort of catapulted him into international celebrity. And he was also known as the editor of probably the most influential left-wing magazine in the 1930s, The New Masses. And I don't think we really have an equivalent today of The New Masses. It really, like, if you, I don't know, put the New Yorker, Jacobin, The Nation, all together into one magazine, it would be it. And it was sort of aligned with the Communist Party, but it was
it was a radical publication with a large readership?
Yes, it was a radical publication with a large readership, and importantly, was a very literary publication. So it would frequently publish not only political commentary, but novelists, poets. It was actually a beautiful magazine with incredibly gorgeous artwork. And so he was just an incredibly important and influential cultural figure of the 1930s, and was also someone known for being sort of verbally pugilistic. So, would engage in these kind of epic battles with, other leftists, with the right, etc. And this is actually, he's actually the person on some level who attracted me to start thinking about the sort of longer history of Jewish left-wing anti-Zionism. So in his novel, Jews Without Money, there's this really interesting subplot about a Jewish dry goods merchant, Baruch Goldfarb, who's sort of a member of the Jewish bourgeoisie in New York City. And he's one of the sole villains of the book. So this book has this kind of Whitmanic, capacious love for, Jewish prostitutes, Jewish gangsters, even Jewish landlords it has some sympathy for. But the one sort of unambiguous villain in this book is Baruch Goldfarb, the Zionist dry goods merchant. And Goldfarb not only is a Zionist, he's also seen as this kind of right-wing political operative in New York City. He engages in vote rigging, labor spies, he's anti-union, and he also is buying up these large tracts of land in Brooklyn and then sort of suburban Brooklyn to move Jews out of Manhattan and into sort of Jewish-only neighborhoods, white Jewish-only neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And so one of the subplots is about the narrator's family and the father who wants to be a success. The father is kind of a striver and wants to be a success and wants to get in with Baruch Goldfarb, move out to this exclusive suburb. And it's seen in the novel that the sort of move of Jews from the Lower East Side, the sort of multiracial, multi-ethnic, left-wing Lower East Side to the sort of exclusive Jewish suburb is analogous on some level to Zionism itself, right? That Zionism is this attempt to sort of create this Jewish-only nation, right? That's sort of at war with everyone around it, and particularly everyone, the indigenous population. And Mike Gold makes this analogy that the move towards Zionism is like the move basically towards suburbanization, towards whiteness, and also towards reactionary politics. So the novel is both very funny, it's a very funny novel, but it's also a tragedy. The father who wants to move out to the suburbs ends up basically essentially dying in a workplace accident that would have been prevented had this union that he essentially worked to prevent had been allowed. And so the message of the book is very clear. If working class Jews align with Zionists, they will possibly die at their workplaces with bourgeois schemes. And then also will align with the forces of whiteness, right? Will become basically right-wing white people. And this is for what the novel is kind of arguing and warning Jews about. And the thing that was very interesting to me about this in this novel is that this didn't need to be explained at all. Like Baruch Goldfarb was introduced as though this was sort of a type that you all know, right? We all know the evil bourgeois, right-wing Jewish Zionist dry goods merchant, and now we're going to make fun of him, right? And so it occurred to me that if this was this kind of subplot in this very popular, influential novel in the 1930s, that this was probably the common sense among kind of left-wing Jews of that time period. And that is what I immediately found out when I started, reading the kind of left-wing Jewish press, is that as one critic in the New Masses, Jewish critic in the New Masses says, in America, nobody is Zionist. 1% of Jews are Zionists. And so for both left-wing Jews in the 1930s, and really up through the 1940s, Zionism was really kind of seen again, as we were talking about earlier, this kind of project of the Jewish bourgeoisie in alignment with an imperial state. And, sometimes people criticize it as being a reactionary project, and sometimes people criticize it as being just sort of, bad for the Jews to align with the British Empire. But it was incredibly, incredibly unpopular.
I've often heard about Zionism before World War II. It really is this fringe movement. Mm-hmm. And then you get World War II, and then you get the aftermath of World War II. You get the Holocaust. Right. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you make the argument that the role of the Holocaust, which is a huge thing, but the role towards Zionism after the Holocaust is overstated.
Yeah, and this I have to be a little careful. So obviously, without the Holocaust, there would be no state of Israel for the very simple reason that you have something like, 1 million refugees who suddenly need a place to go, and by hook and by crook are sort of conscripted. Some go voluntarily, many go semi-voluntarily to Palestine to basically flee Europe. And without that sort of immediate influx of refugees, there would be no 1948 war, or at least it would have gone very differently, I think, for the Israelis. And then, of course, obviously, the Holocaust created an enormous amount of sympathy for the idea of a Jewish homeland, and which I think the Zionists, of course, were very happy to mobilize on their behalf. But what I found very interesting going through the archive of Jewish left publications was that didn't actually seem to be true, at least in the Jewish left publications that I was reading. There is this period from really kind of when the Holocaust becomes kind of widely known about in the United States, maybe 1933, 1944, up until 1947, when partition gets declared by the United Nations, that there's this very active and wide debate about Zionism. And people who, like I said, were very active in the Jewish left, very actively identified themselves as Jewish, lived wholly and totally within a Jewish left world. Even after the Holocaust, we're saying we have no right to create a Jewish-only state and displace, 500,000 people. The number that was thrown around in the late 1930s and 1940s was, somewhere 300 to 500,000 people would have to be displaced to create a Jewish homeland, which ended up being an undercount, but at the time was very shocking. How could you possibly displace 500,000 people? And so, so even after the Holocaust, the line again, I'm talking about the Jewish left, on the Jewish left really didn't change all that much. The only kind of modification that was made was that if Jews are trying to flee Europe and they're being barred from entry into the United States, which they were.
They were.
Yeah, they were. And that they have to go somewhere. And if Palestine is the only place they can go, that's fine, but they don't have a right to displace anyone else, right? You can be a refugee, you just don't have the right to, once you get to your, place of arrival, to throw out the people who live there. And what changes really, and this again was sort of surprising and shocking to me when I was doing this research. What really changes is the Soviet Union coming out for the state of Israel in 1947. And the Soviet Union actually beat the United States to it. And so, Andrei Gromyko very dramatically comes out to the UN and says, the world did nothing to stop the Holocaust. And now you have a chance to make amends and support the state of Israel. And not only was it a very, rhetorically compelling speech, but we have to understand the Soviet Union. We think of the Soviet Union now as a Stalinist dungeon, at least, particularly in the period from Stalin's rise in the 20s to Stalin's death in the 50s. But to, a lot of left-wing, even liberal Americans, the Soviet Union was the country that defeated Hitler, right? And it's, it's true. I mean, if it hadn't been
and always influential in the American left, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And this is also before the Khrushchev revelation. So a lot of communists, you could say naively, or maybe you could say, earnestly, said, well, America lies about all kinds of stuff. And so, maybe these stories about the gulags are exaggerations as well. And so, yeah, so the Communist Party and the Soviet Union actually had a great deal of prestige. And of course, we also have to remember the Soviet Union was America's ally in the 1940s. And Roosevelt, this changes, the Dies Committee and Truman. But Roosevelt, was not a vicious anti-communist in the way that, the later Democratic Party and, recognized the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And so to be pro-Soviet in the 1930s in the United States was not a freakish position. And many liberals, I think, could actually look at some of the positive things the Soviet Union was doing on the world stage, and of course did not know about the gulags and did not know that Stalin was personally anti-Semite. And so the Soviet Union coming out for the state of Israel was just incredibly influential. And so you see overnight the left press just turn on a dime, right? And of course
the left press.
Yeah. So people who were previously anti-Zionists, in 1946. suddenly in 1947, when Gromyko makes his speech, are just okay. Well, if the Soviet Union said it's good, then it must be the proper left position to take, right? And I'm not saying that makes it okay. I'm not trying to issue, some kind of a statement that the Soviet Union was correct. And the Soviet Union's reasons for doing this, were purely geopolitical. Stalin had no love for the Jews, famously. At the same time, he's backing the state of Israel. He's also imprisoning the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, right? This for Stalin, and you see this today. You have people who are pro-Israel and also anti-Semitic, and so Stalin was, of course, not the first one, but perhaps one of the most consequential anti-Semitic Zionists, briefly. And of course, the Soviet Union changed its tune. Really by the 50s, but also the Soviet Union, sent weapons through Czechoslovakia, and so really kind of won the war on some level. So yeah, but that was incredibly influential. But the other thing I think we have to think about too is that the foundation of the state of Israel, and in terms of the American left, happens at the same time the Red Scare is really kind of ramping up in earnest, and so being not only a communist but really a leftist of any stripe whatsoever in the United States was seen as treasonous, and thousands of communists went to jail in the Smith Act, were deported. Countless numbers of left institutions were banned or collapsed under pressure. Of course, there's the nightly spectacle of the HUAC hearings. Most of the progressive labor unions were thrown out of the AFL-CIO. And so, the immediate concern of many communists was really not, and so I'm not saying that Israel-Palestine disappears entirely from the pages of the left, but if you go through the kind of pages of the Jewish left, that is not what people are talking about. People are talking about the Red Scare, they're talking about the Cold War, they're talking about the threat of nuclear annihilation. And also, like I said, it's kind of you could say a trough, a nadir of the American left, the sort of 1950s. And so, but the interesting thing for me, and by the way, if you want to interrupt me,
I will. Oh, I will.
Okay,
Ben.
yes.
Yes.
Okay, yes. Yeah. But the really interesting thing for me, and one of the theses of this book, is that basically, whenever you get a kind of resurgence of the American left, and particularly the American Jewish left, you also get a reintroduction or a rearticulation of anti-Zionist politics. And so, of course, sort of Israel-Palestine kind of stays off the front pages in a lot of ways through the 1950s, but really emerges back into the American conversation in the 1960s, particularly with both the rise of sort of third world liberation struggles, in which the Palestine Liberation Front, PLO, PLFP, becomes sort of part of the kind of fabric of kind of third world liberation struggles, but also the Six-Day War the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. And while the American press was very much in love with Israel defeating all of its, Arab nationalist Soviet-backed enemies, in the left press, Israel suddenly looked like just another imperial power, right? So they're backed by the United States. They engage in a war of aggression against all of its neighbors, occupy the West Bank, and Sinai and the Golan Heights. And so a large part of the left basically sort of ends up essentially articulating the same position that the communist left in the 1930s and 40s articulated, which is that Israel is aligned with imperialism as an occupying power, is against the interests of sort of third world liberation. And particularly, although it changes a little bit in terms of who is articulating the critique most loudly, it's really the kind of the black left that kind of begins this conversation in the 1960s. So it's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1967 that comes out with a statement in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. And it's when SNCC comes out that the new left, sort of SDS particular, but also SWP and other kind of parts of the so-called, was then described the white left, came out in solidarity with SNCC.
And is
but
the
also,
left still at this point in the 60s made up of a significant number of Jews? Like they were in the 30s?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is the interesting thing. People refer to in the literature of the 1960s, they talk about SDS. It was referred to at the time. I think people wouldn't maybe use this terminology today, but people were a lot more frank. Back in the 1960s, there was the white left and the black left, and the white left was SDS, and the black left was SNCC, and then later, Black Panther Party. And the white left, SDS, was actually also largely Jewish. So in SDS, there's actually a funny anecdote. One of the people I interviewed was Dick Flax, who was one of the original members of the Port Huron, authors of the Port Huron Statement, attended the famous meeting in Port Huron, Michigan, and he looks at his buddy Steve Max. I mean, I know it sounds like a comedy routine, Dick Flax and Steve Max, but anyways, he looks to his buddy. They're both New York Jews, and they're like, "Great, the meeting's only half Jewish," which at that time, because Dick Flax is a Jewish New Yorker and a leftist, is used to the left-wing meetings he goes to in New York City being all Jewish, and so he's like, okay, this is great. It's only half Jewish. We've made it into America, and but of course, the largest left-wing organization, white left-wing organization in the 1960s, being half Jewish, is still very Jewish, and so and SDS averaged kind of like the Communist Party, about 100,000 members at its peak. And it depended where you went, so if you're the SDS chapter in, Boise, Idaho. I don't know actually if Boise, Idaho had an SDS chapter, but if you're the SDS chapter, in Boise, Idaho, probably are going to be less Jewish. But if you're the SDS chapter at Columbia, or in SUNY Buffalo, it was like three-quarters Jewish. So yeah, so that's the other point that I make, is that the left of the 1960s was largely Jewish and sort of came in the same position that the left of the 1930s came to. And I think, it's interesting as well.
Anti-Zionist. They're anti-Zionist.
Anti-Zionist. Yeah. And of course, there was the emergence of kind of left-wing Zionist organizations, the Radical Zionist Alliance, that tried to sort of mimic the language of the left. But I would say in terms of left-wing politics, they were fairly marginal. And then, of course, like most of the kind of important left-wing intellectual figures of the 1960s in the United States, like Noam Chomsky, I.F. Stone, these people, Erwin Silber, these people were of the National Guardian. And then, of course, Isaac Deutscher, who's not American, but was very influential, particularly the sort of Trotskyist left of the 1960s, was also anti-Zionist. And so, most of the sort of important Jewish figures of the 1960s, probably most famously, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. Jerry Rubin has the famous line, if Moses were alive today, he'd be an Arab guerrilla. And if you think about who were the recognizable kind of famous Jewish faces of the New Left, I mean, it's Abby Hoffman, right? Abby Hoffman's probably the most famous Jew of the 1967, 1968. And, he was a committed anti-Zionist. Would write these like passionate letters to his wife, just saying, I hate Israel, exclamation, exclamation, exclamation point. It's everything that's against what I understand to be Jewish. So
is this a stereotype, or is there something to Jews and the left, specifically the American left, but maybe not just American left? I think you see a lot of influence of the left and Jews in Russia, in Eastern Europe. But I want to know if you think there's something to. I think back to the early 20th century. I think of somebody like Emma Goldman, a radical. One of the best known radicals from the early 20th century. We talked about the Communist Party and Jews in the 1930s. Now we're talking about the New Left in the 19th. Right. Is there something to this connection of the Jewish people and leftist politics?
Yeah, again, it's a complicated question because for a number of reasons. One, obviously, Israel, with its current fascist and right-wing ruling party, and has had right-wing parties, in the driver's seat for quite some time now, certainly suggests there's nothing inherent to being Jewish that makes one a leftist. And of course, the left is a rather modern invention, right? Obviously, what you call the left has different origin points, but of course, one origin point would be the French Revolution, right? This is where the term the left, comes from. And so,
And with the French Revolution, I don't mean to say everything was great for Jews after that, but it did give, didn't it give
oh
Jews
yeah,
citizenship?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Haskalah, it's the sort of Jewish Enlightenment is really much a kind of product of the French Revolution, and this is, of course, a lot of Jewish scholars will suggest that, there's this kind of normative, you could say, European Jewish liberalism. So the idea of a Jewish fascist, Jabotinsky or now, Netanyahu, still seems sort of shocking to people, and there is this, I think, stereotype that's partially a stereotype, but also, I think, partially earned that, sort of Jews are natural liberals, and a lot of Jewish studies scholars will talk about sort of normative Jewish liberalism. And yeah, and one of the origin points of this is basically the French Revolution giving Jews citizenship rights, essentially for the first time, right? And this is sort of the beginning of what's called the Jewish Haskalah or the Jewish Enlightenment, and this sort of notion that Jews thrive, and just in a material way, right? That Jews thrive in pluralistic. Jews are a minority, up until the foundation of the State of Israel, Jews are a minority wherever they go. And so if you're a minority with a history of discrimination, at various places and times, the argument goes Jews thrive in a liberal, pluralistic, tolerant, secular society, right? And that the sort of, history of anti-Semitism in the European context has often been the history of, you know, Christian, supremacist movements, the Inquisition, etc. And again, the Inquisition predates the left, but I don't think anybody would suggest the Inquisition was a left-wing movement, right? So there's a long historical interaction, engagement with liberal thinking and Jewish intellectual figures. The notion of a Jewish left, of course, it is an anti-Semitic stereotype of the Jewish Bolshevik, right? And there's a really great book by Paul Hennebrink called The Judeo-Bolshevik Threat. But there is some truth to it. Like I said, the Communist Party in Russia had an outsized Jewish presence. And then, of course, the United States, actually, there's a really wonderful book by Tony Michaels called The Fire in Our Hearts, which kind of is a prehistory of the Jewish left before the Communist Party about the Jewish socialist movements from the late 19th century, actually makes the argument that American Jewish leftism, what the scholar Karen Brogdon refers to as hegemonic Jewish socialism, that a socialism was hegemonic in the Jewish sort of Ashkenazi, Yiddish-speaking Jewish world of the late 19th to basically the Red Scare. Was really kind of an autochthonous American invention. That on some level, actually, the story that socialism was a sort of foreign import to America from Russia, from Eastern Europe, and that American Jews, as soon as they assimilated, ceased being socialists. Michaels basically said is not true and has never been true. In fact, actually, it was the other way around. In a lot of ways, New York City was the hub of kind of global socialism for a while, particularly in the Jewish world, and that Eastern European Jews were going to New York and then going back to Eastern Europe and sort of preaching the good word. And there's actually a famous, scene of Trotsky being in New York City and sort of going back then to Eastern Europe and making kind of Michaels makes the argument that was actually a fairly typical kind of intellectual circuit, and that it was actually American Jewish leftists that were influencing the sort of Jewish world of the Pale Settlement. And it was, I think kind of a beautiful American story in some ways. So, Michaels makes the argument that it was the interaction between German socialists. So actually, if anybody was the sort of foreign agitator bringing socialism from abroad, it was actually the German socialists who were fleeing the 1848 sort of crackdown and the, reactionary German state. And there's these like amazing stories of like German generals during the Civil War giving their soldiers communist manifestos to read, and things along those lines. So there is this history of 19th century German socialism.
So you get like the rise of socialism in Milwaukee, right?
Exactly. Yeah. This is why you have Milwaukee, the red city, which, and again, people don't normally think of Milwaukee as the most radical town in America. Excuse me. But it was for a time. And of course, Yiddish and German are not the same language, but they have a lot of common vocabulary. And so, these Yiddish-speaking Jews and German socialists could communicate. But there's also, of course, was a lot of interaction and interest in among the early Jewish immigrants and the plight of African Americans. So a lot of Jewish socialist writers immediately saw their treatment, the links between their treatment in the Pale of Settlement as second-class citizens facing pogroms and the fate of African Americans in the United States. And so in a lot of ways, like I said, the history of the American left or the Jewish left, again, it's not the only left-wing Jewish community in the world, and of course, not every Jew in America by a long stretch is a left-winger. But there was an outsized presence on the left in the United States among Jewish Americans. And it really was, on some level, a kind of American and I would say a Jewish adaptation to American life. And I think part of it had to do with the fact that Jews saw America. This is very typical in kind of the Jewish left of the late 19th century, even through the Communist Party. I mean, one of the things that's sort of funny about the Communist Party in the 1930s is that it was very optimistic about America. And it's funny to say that communists would be optimistic about America because, of course, they were quite critical of America. But a lot of Jewish immigrants, they said, well, yes, America is a capitalist, maybe the most capitalist country in the world, and it is incredibly racist, but it is also a formal democracy. And so this gives us the opportunity to organize in ways that we could not organize in Tsarist Russia, right, or in Bismarck's Germany or whatever. And so even though they understood that America was a racist and oppressive country in a lot of ways, and also very anti-Semitic, in particularly the 1920s with the passage of the Johnson-Reed Act and the heyday of the Klan, they saw in that opportunity to organize and in at least the rhetoric of American pluralism an opportunity to not only remake kind of secular Jewish culture, but also to find a kind of place in American society that felt true to their own feelings of being Jewish, but also felt would make them good Americans. And so there's this feeling among a lot of the Communist Party members and Socialist Party is that actually being a socialist is, and this again sounds completely bonkers to an American ear today, and I actually find myself sometimes having a hard time wrapping my mind around it. But they felt that being a communist was being a good American. And actually my grandpa, who was a member of the Communist Party, would hang an American flag every 4th of July. And we get in these like arguments about it. I was like, Grandpa, you were fired from your job for being a communist. And maybe your like love of America, you should think about it a little bit more. And he was like, enough with that, hippie crap from you.
Who are you? Who are you to tell me?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But he really had this idea on some level. He took very seriously the slogan from the Popular Front that, communism is 20th century Americanism. And I think for Jews, this always had this, that this is sort of this path to our assimilation on our own terms. That is, we want to be good Americans, we want to be good Americans, in an America that's going to look like our best values, and so.
Benjamin Balthaser has been our guest. I think you've heard me say before, the tyranny of the clock.
It just got started.
I know, we did just get started. We're just scratching the surface. Benjamin Balthaser's upcoming book that will be out in the fall is called Whole World, The American Jewish Left and Cultures of Anti-Zionism. We're going to have him back when this book comes out to talk about the book and to get into more of these things. Benjamin Balthaser is also Associate Professor of Multi-Ethnic U.S. Literature at Indiana University, South Bend. Benjamin Balthaser, that was wildly fascinating, and I thank you for taking this time to talk to us today.
Thank you. This is lovely. It was lovely talking with you, Mitch.
Here we are driving down the road, and all of a sudden, bang! Oh! There was a crack in our windshield. You know what we can do now, though, right?
Go to safelight.com.
And we're good to go.
Hey guys, I'll be replacing the windshield for you.